Welcome back and welcome to part 3 of this Blender tutorial series where we're creating this rocky river nature animation. So this is where we left off in the last part. So in part 1 we did the modeling, and then in part 2 we did the lighting and the materials. So in this part we're going to be creating some medium and small rocks, and then we're going to be using geometry nodes to place the rocks on the environment. Now real quick before we start, I'm able to make these free tutorials here on YouTube thanks to all of my amazing supporters. So if you're enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to help support me and this channel, then I'll have some links in the description to my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. Those are great ways to help support this channel. So if you join my Patreon page, then you'll be supporting the channel monthly and you'll get access to many Blender resources, such as artwork project files, procedural materials, 3D models and assets, and other Blender content on my Patreon. Or if you'd like to just make a one-time purchase, then everything that I have on my Patreon page I also have on my Gumroad store, so you can check that out with the link in the description. And if you'd like to help support the channel monthly here on YouTube, then a great way to do that is by checking out the YouTube memberships by clicking down there on the join button next to the subscribe button. And I do appreciate your support. Alright, so let's now create the medium rocks and the small rocks. So I'm going to click back here to the layout so I can see this in full screen, and I'll go back to solid view. So I want to hide everything here in the scene, so I'm going to drag the outliner down, and then I can click on this button here just to hide everything in that collection. So I'm now just going to right click here in the outliner, I'll click on new collection, and I'm going to double click on this, and I'm going to rename this one to medium rock. So now we can add all the medium rocks in this collection, and then we'll use that collection to distribute the rocks using geometry nodes. So I'll press Shift C to center the cursor, and then let's go to the add menu. And earlier in this tutorial series we added the extra objects add-on. So with that add-on enabled, if you go to the add menu, you're going to have some new objects here, and we want to go to the rock generator, and I'll just zoom into the rock. Now right above me you can see there's the little add rock setting. You can just click on the arrow to open this up, and I want to add 5 different medium rocks. So let's change the number all the way up to 5 rocks. So I can now close the add rock settings, and I now want to click on each one of these rocks, and I'm just going to move them over. So I'm just going to select the rocks and move them over so they're not on top of each other. So now I want to change some of the rocks because some of the rocks are a bit weird. I don't really like the shape of some of these rocks. So you can go into edit mode and you can select some of the vertices, and we still have the proportional editing enabled. So I can just grab some of the vertices and kind of pull them around just to make the rock look a bit better. So just change the shape and just get the shape to how you like. That is a much better rock. Also this one here, I'm going to go into edit mode, and this rock is a bit funky. So what I'm going to do is hit K for the knife tool, and I'll click here, then click here, then click here, and just hit enter. And then I can select that vertex there and just kind of pull this out just so it's a bit better. Just kind of rotate this around. And then this one here, I'm just going to move this around just because I don't want a rock which is super pointy, so I'm going to make that smaller. So something like that is pretty good, and I do want a little bit of variation in the size, but not too much. I generally want them to be about the same size, but a few can be a bit bigger or smaller. Now I could make these rocks much more detailed by going here to the modifiers, and I could turn up the viewport levels on the subsurf. But I don't actually want to do that because these rocks are going to be smaller and they're going to be distributed on the rest of the environment with the geometry nodes. So I don't want these rocks to be too high poly or they will make the scene more laggy. So I'm going to keep the levels viewport down to 2. So what I'm going to do now is apply all the modifiers so that this is actual geometry. Now you can just click on the modifier and then you can press Ctrl A to apply it, but a faster way to do this is to enable this really cool modifiers tools add-on. So to enable the add-on, let's go edit, and then we can go to the preferences. And if you go here to the add-ons in the user preferences, you can start to search for modifier, and you can check mark this really cool modifiers tools add-on. And then you can just close the user preferences, and we now have these cool buttons right here. So I'm going to select the rock, and I'll just click on apply all. And I can just click on each rock and just click on apply all, and it will just apply all the modifiers. So now if we go into edit mode on any of these rocks, you can see it's actual geometry. Now I want to get rid of those mean creases. There's those creases right there, and they make the rock look a little bit weird in some areas. So to do this for all of them, I'm just going to box select all the rocks, and I'll join all the rocks together together with Control J, so they're one object. So now if I go into edit mode and select everything, I can just open up the side panel here, and I'm going to click here on item and just make sure you have all of the rocks mesh selected. So we now have this mean crease right here, and I can turn the mean crease to 0. So now if I deselect everything and look around here, you can see that there's no creases. So if I go back to object mode now, I can just shade the object smooth with the object context menu. Now I want these to be their own object again, so I'll just go back into edit mode and I will just select everything, and then I can just use the P key to separate, and I'll just separate by loose parts. Now if I go back to object mode, these are all their own object. Now you can see the origin point is all right over here on that one object, so I'm just going to box select all the rocks. And let's go to object, and we want to set the origin to the geometry. So now the origin is in the center there. So now I can just kind of rotate the rocks and play around with them further. So when we use the geometry nodes to distribute the rocks on the environment, the rocks are going to be distributed where the origin point is. So on each one of these rocks, I want to go into edit mode, and I'll go to side view, and I will just select everything, and I'm going to rotate the rock. I can also click right here to turn off the proportional editing, and I'm going to move the rock up, and I just want to put the origin point there on the bottom. So that way the rock will be kind of coming up, but it'll be distributed from the bottom. So I'm going to do that for all the rocks. So I'll just go into edit mode, select everything, and I'll just kind of rotate the rock around. And one other thing that I want to do is I kind of want to find the flattest part of the rock, and I want to put that here on the ground. So I'll go back to object node, go into edit mode here, just kind of rotate that up here, and that's kind of a flat part of the rock, so I'll put that part on the bottom. Go back to object mode, and this one here, I'll go into edit mode, select everything, and I can just rotate this rock around, and there's a pretty flat part right there, so I'll just rotate that up there, and go back to object mode, and this one here, rotate it, kind of move it around. And then if you want to make any parts even flatter, then you can select a vertex and you can turn on the proportional editing. And then you can scale the vertex, and then you can scale it on the z-axis. And so because I have the proportional editing on, it's going to grab the vertices around it, and so we can flatten the bottom of the rock. So if you want to do that, you can do it for some of the other rocks. So I'll select the vertex, I'll scale it on the z-axis, and I can scroll my mouse wheel out here to make the proportional editing bigger. And I'm just going to keep on doing that for some of the rocks just to kind of flatten the bottoms of it a little bit more. Also, this rock here, it is a little bit large, so I might just flatten it down a little bit. And also, if you wanted to, if there's any weird lumpy parts like this, you can use the proportional editing and just kind of pull around the mesh to get the shape of the rock that you want. All right, so that is pretty good. So we now have all those rocks, they're rotated at a good rotation, and you can see the origin points are on the bottom of the rocks. Now, all of these rocks are a bit large in the Blender scene, so I'm going to scale all the rocks down, and I'll just punch in 0.2 and then enter, just so that they're a better size for the scene. So now I'll use Control A, and I want to apply the rotation and the scale, so this is now the new default rotation and scale. And so that'll be better for when we're setting it up with the geometry nodes. So these are the medium rocks, but I also want to have some even smaller rocks. So I'm just going to select 3 of these. I think I'll select this one, and this one here. I think I like those ones. And I'm going to duplicate these, and I'll just move them over, and I can bring them close to each other. Now I want to select all 3 of these rocks, and then you can use the M key to move the rocks. And I want to add them into a new collection of just small rocks. So I'll click on new collection, and I can just rename these to small rocks. Click on OK, and now in the outliner, if I make this a bit bigger, I can close this, and we just have small rocks and medium rocks. So for these small rocks, I want to make them even smaller. So I'm going to select them, and then I will scale them, and I'll scale these down to like a 0.4 so they're even smaller. Now we're going to be distributing the small rocks on the environment as well using the geometry nodes, but these rocks are going to be so small that we can make them even lower poly, and that way the scene won't be quite as dense. So to make these rocks lower poly, you can click on the rock, and on the modifiers here, you can add the decimate modifier. So add the decimate, and then you can turn the ratio down, and it's going to get rid of more and more of the mesh, but it's going to try to keep the same rock shape. So I can turn this like way down, maybe to just like a 0.2, and then you can just apply the decimate modifier, and now this rock is much less dense, so it still has about the same shape, but there's much less vertices. So I'll do the same thing for this rock, so we can add modifier, let's add the decimate. I can turn the ratio way down so it is much lower poly, and then I can just apply that modifier. And we'll go over to this one as well. Let's add modifier, decimate. We'll turn this way down so it's much lower poly, and then we can just apply that modifier. Now I want the small rocks to look a bit more unique, so I want the shape to be different. So I'm going to go into edit mode of these rocks, and I'll just select some vertices, and we still have the proportional editing on. So I'm just going to make these rocks a bit more random. Maybe I'll give them a random rotation, and I'll also just kind of change the shape of them to make them look a bit different. Maybe flatten this one down a bit. Then I can go into edit mode of this one, kind of change the shape of this one as well, maybe make it not so pointy, and then I'll do the same thing for this one just to add a bit of variation. So that is pretty good, so those rocks look much more different. And then also we need to select these rocks, and we again need to apply the rotation and scale now that we've rotated them and scaled them. And then we also want to add the same rock material to these rocks. So I'm going to go into the rendered view, and let's click down here on the material properties. So I'm just going to select one of the rocks, and we'll click on the drop down, and I can add the rock material from the previous part of the tutorial series. So now I can box select all the rocks, but then I'm just going to lastly shift select this rock here with the material. And then to link all of the materials, we'll use Control L, and we're just going to go down here to link materials, so they all have the same material. All right, so now we have some nice rock objects. So let's go back to solid view, and we can now hide these from the view. So right up here in the outliner, I can hide the medium rocks and hide the small rocks, and then this original collection, we will turn that back on, and that's the main scene. So we can now go into the camera view, and let's now distribute these using the geometry nodes. So if you don't have a geometry nodes layout, you can click on the plus here, and then you can go down here and add geometry nodes. Now there's a few things here I don't need. One thing I'm going to do is close this side panel, so I'll click right up here when the crosshair appears, and I'm going to click and drag over, and then drag back and let go just to close that. And then I also want to close this side panel with the T key. I'm also going to close this widget here because I don't need it, and then I'll make this a bit smaller. And personally, I like having the 3D view over here and then the nodes over here. So if you right click here, we can do a vertical split, and I'll drop a vertical split right there, and then here in the corner you can drag up and down and just split that window. So now we have geometry nodes over here. So let's now go into the camera view, just select the main environment, and let's add new geometry nodes, and I can just rename the geometry nodes to rocks. And make sure to press Ctrl S every now and then to save your project. So let's now distribute the rocks on the environment. So I'm first going to go here to the add menu, and we're going to search for the distribute points on faces. And let's drop this right in here. And then I also want to go to the add menu, and we want to search for the instance on points. So the instance on points node, and this way we can actually instance the rocks. So let's drop this here after the distribute points on faces. Now it gets rid of the mesh, and that's because we need to add a join geometry to join the geometry back up. So if we go to the add menu, we can search for the join geometry. Let's put this after the instance on points, and then the geometry, the original geometry, we can plug that into the join geometry. So now we're adding back the original meshes geometry, and we can now use the distribute points on faces to add the rocks. So I'm going to drag these back a bit so I have a bit more space in here, and I now want to add the rocks. So if I go to the add menu, I can go to the search, and I want to search for the collection info node so that we can add the rock data. So we'll put this here, and if you remember, we just added the rocks into their own collections. So if we click here, we can choose the medium rocks and the small rocks. I'm going to first start with the medium rocks. So let's select the medium rocks in the collection info, and we can put the instance into the instance here on the instance on points. So now it's going to add tons of rocks all over the mesh, and it's very detailed. So I want to click on the separate children, and also the reset children, and also the pick instance. Now I want to have more control over how many rocks there are. So if I click on the random, I want to change this to the Poisson disk. So the Poisson disk will give us the density max, and that's how many rocks there are. So I can turn down the density max. There's also this factor here, so if you just want to turn down all the rocks or turn them up, you can change that. And then there's the distance min, and the distance min is the minimum distance between each rock. So if you want to make sure there aren't any two rocks which are overlapping each other, you can turn the distance min up to a very small amount, and this way it'll make sure there's a minimum amount in between each rock. So if I turn this way up, you can see now there's kind of an even distance in between those rocks. So I do want to turn the distance min up, but just a very small amount. out. So I'll turn my distance min to a 0.13. Now, if you go into the camera view here and kind of look at the rocks, you can clearly see there's many rocks which are being duplicated, like there's that rock there, and it's like in the same spot. So we're going to make this more randomized so that you can't notice that it's just the same rocks being duplicated over and over. And to fix this, we're going to add random rotation values and random scale values. So I'll go to the add menu, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the random value node. Let's drop this down here, and I first want to just control the scale. So let's put the random value into the scale, and now it's randomly going to generate values from 0 to 1, or whichever the minimum and maximum values are. So the minimum value, I do want to turn that up just a little bit, so I'll turn this up a bit more. And I'm going to go with like a 0.42, and then here on the maximum value, I don't want those rocks to be quite that big, so I'll turn this to like a 0.69, so they're a bit smaller. But you can already see there's so much more variation because some rocks are bigger and some rocks are smaller. And also if you go into rendered mode, you can see the change in the lighting, like some parts are in shadow and some parts are lighter, and the texture is kind of a little bit different, so that also helps to randomize it. But another really great way to randomize this is to add a random rotation, and that way, like this rock and this rock, we won't be looking at the same side of the rock, we'll be looking at a different angle. So to do that, we can add the random value into the rotation. Now, I don't want the rocks to be rotated on all axes. I only want them to be rotated on the z-axis because we made the rocks flat on the bottom. So I'm just going to duplicate the random value node, and I want to click on the float here, and we'll use vector instead. So vector is going to break up the values into 3 values. So we can put this value now into the random rotation, and now we can take this maximum value and we can take the bottom one and we can rotate this. So the first one and second one are going to be the x and y values, but the third one here is going to be the z value. So if I rotate this around, now you can see it's only randomly rotating the rocks on the z-axis. So here on the bottom maximum value, I'll just turn this up to like a giant number like 100, so it's randomly moving the rocks around. Now there also are these values here, and if I turn them to 0, now you can see the rocks are just perfectly straight. But if I click and then drag down and then drag back and forth, this is going to randomize the x and the y values. So I do want to turn this up a little bit just to make them look slightly more random, but I don't want to turn them up too much or else the flat part of the rock will be sticking up. So I might just go with like a 0.1 or maybe just like a 0.3 so they're rotated slightly. And I can go into the rendered view just to kind of see how that's looking, and that is much more random. Now there's these big rocks right here, and then there's also these medium rocks which we distributed. And then right down here we kind of get to the gravel, and the gravel's a bit low quality, but when we render it, it will be a bit higher quality because of the subsurf. However, there isn't really any blending between the medium rocks and the gravel. So that's where we're going to be adding these small rocks, and that'll just give a nice variation. So there will be big rocks, then medium rocks, then we'll add the small rocks, and then there will be the little bits of gravel. So to add the small rocks, we can use the same geometry node setup. So let's just box select all of these nodes here. What we can do is we can press Ctrl-Shift-D instead of Shift-D. That'll duplicate the nodes, but it'll keep the wire plugged up. And I'm going to duplicate the nodes and just stick them right up here. And then we can drag the join geometry over, and we can take this other instance on points and put that into the geometry. So now we just have double the amount of rocks on top of each other. You can see the rocks look really dark because there's overlapping mesh. So to fix this, we can change the collection info. So on this collection info up here, we can delete the medium rocks, and then instead we're going to add these small rocks. So now there are going to be small rocks. Now you can't see any of the small rocks, and that is because they're placed right in the same spot as the medium rocks. So to fix this, we can just change the seed value. So you really just need to turn the seed value to a different number. So this one can be 1 and this one can be 0, but now the seed value is set to 1. There's more rocks here and there. Now I want there to be many more of these smaller rocks. So on the distribute points on faces, we can turn the density max up, and I think I might turn this up to like a 6. We'll see how that looks, and that's quite a bit better. Now there's a lot of little rocks. That might be a little bit too many though, so I might turn this down to just like a 5. And then if you don't like where the rocks are, you can of course change the seed values. So on both of the distribute points on faces, you can just change the seed. I'm going to go go back to solid view so it's not quite as laggy. So I can change the seed around and it's just going to randomly distribute the rocks. Now, one small thing that I noticed, I think I want the medium rocks to be a little bit bigger. So if I go down here to the medium rocks, I want to go to the random value and I want to turn this maximum value up just so that all of the medium rocks can be a bit bigger. And also the min here, I can also turn this up just so they can be a little bit bigger. I definitely don't want to overdo it though, so I might turn the min to 0.45 and the max to 0.8. Now, another important thing to note is that if you change the subsurface level of the environment, that is going to affect where the rocks are placed. So if I just select the environment here, we can go back here to the layout and I'll go into rendered mode again. And what we can do is just go here to the modifier properties. So if I go here to the subsurf, you can see the levels viewport is set to 2, but it's going to render at 3. So if I just turn this up to 3 to see how it's looking, it's much more detailed with 3, but you can see it moved the rocks around. And that's because if we change the viewport levels, it's actually changing the shape of the mesh, and so that's changing where the rocks are placed. So once you've placed the rocks where you want them, we can go back here to the layout. And I'm going to select the mesh again, and let's turn the levels viewport down to like 2, just so that it's not quite as laggy. Now there's a small detail that I want to add, and that is that I will kind of want to break up this background because right now it looks a little bit flat, and it's kind of easy to notice that the texture is tiling a little bit. There's kind of that big rock there, and then it kind of looks like there's the same rock right there. So I'm going to go back to solid view. We can just select the environment, and we'll go into edit mode. And you can just select some vertices, and you can move them around, and then remember to just scroll your mouse wheel to turn up the proportional editing. And I just want to make the environment look a little bit more bumpy. So I'm going to have the environment coming out a bit, then I'll have the environment going back in a little bit, and I'll just make it a bit more random, and that's really going to break up the mesh and kind of break up the texture, so it's harder to see any tiling. You can also go into the camera view and kind of make some parts higher, and then make a few other parts a bit lower, just kind of making the mesh a bit more randomized. Kind of move this around as well. You could also maybe bring up a few parts here, kind of bring this up a little bit if you wanted to. And back in rendered mode, you can see that definitely looked quite a bit nicer because it's a bit more bumpy now. Now, if you just take a look at this scene, there is a bunch of detail in this scene, and it's kind of hard to focus on one thing. Now, I want the viewer to focus on these rocks because these rocks are the most detailed. They're kind of generally in the center of the scene, but a little bit to the side, but I mainly want to be able to focus kind of on the river and these rocks and a little bit on the environment. But all this over here, this is quite distracting. There's a lot of detail and a lot of contrast. So a really great way to make the scene look more realistic and improve the compositing is to add a depth of field. So I'll just go to the add menu, and I first want to add some object that the camera will focus on. So I'll go here to empty, and let's add just a plane axis. And then I can just move the plane axis around, and I'm just going to bring it forward here, and then I can just bring it down here. And I want to bring this empty object right here where the rock is, and I'll scale it down a bit. And I want to put this on the rock surface. So this is what the camera is going to be focusing on. So now we can just select the camera, and we can go to the object data properties, and down here on the depth of field, we'll just first turn the depth of field on, and then if we go to the eyedropper right here on the focus object, we'll just add the rock. So then we can go back into rendered view and see how that's looking. And already the background is a bit more blurred, so you don't really want to focus on it quite as much, and there's not quite as much detail. But then right down here, the scene is very sharp because that's what the camera is focusing on. So I can just turn the f-stop down. If I turn the f-stop down way too small, now only where the empty is, that's where it's going to focus on. So I do want to turn this up a bit because I don't want to make it too strong. So I think that an f-stop value of 1.4 looks pretty good for this scene. That way you're really not focusing too much on the background, it still is there, but you're mainly just focusing on these rocks here, and also the river, and also the side of the river there. Alright, so just remember to save the project again, and this is going to wrap it up for part 3 of the tutorial. So I hope you're enjoying this, and thank you for watching. And so in the last part, in part 4, we will be finishing up the scene, so we'll be doing a few more things just to make the scene look really nice. We'll do the animation, we'll render out the frames, and we'll compile the frames together in Blender's video editor and add some sound effects and get the finished video. So when the last part is released, it'll be up on the end screen and the links in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the last part.